Imagine purchasing an airport. You secure some land, pave a landing strip, welcome the jets, and just gather the cash. It feels like the ultimate modern toll plaza, where there is only a single entry and exit, and every traveler hands you their money. You face absolutely zero rivals, since no one is going to construct a competing terminal right next door to yours. As the sole option available, you can just relax, observe the flight's landing, and watch your profits pile up. While that fantasy seems incredible, it actually holds a grain of truth. But the real issue lies in bridging that dream with reality. You have to consider the massive initial buy-in, the astronomical daily operating expenses, and the catastrophic impact of a global grounding of flights. Even brilliant infrastructure giants, armed with hundreds of billions in capital, have suffered massive losses on seemingly flawless airport investments. So, who is actually putting these massive transport hubs on the market in the first place? Historically, they were taxpayer-funded public works owned entirely by governments. But a massive industry shift occurred during the 1980s. State authorities recognized they held incredibly lucrative assets, while buyers saw the 50-year appeal of a monopoly with guaranteed passenger flow. This mutual realization sparked a massive privatization movement across over 90 nations, bringing private capital to more than 800 global airfields today. While private entities handle huge majorities of passenger traffic in Europe and Latin America, the United States market operates in complete reverse. Aside from one commercial facility in Puerto Rico, iconic American hubs remain publicly owned because tax-exempt bonds essentially block out private buyers. Typically, nations transfer these hubs through direct sales, public stock, or extended lease agreements that let governments maintain ultimate asset ownership. For instance, a long-term lease of Sydney's hub resulted in a $32 billion takeover that investors actually considered to be a fair bargain. To understand this valuation, investors look at a metric called EBITDA, which measures operational profits before factoring in taxes, interest, and other accounting nuances. Typically, a thriving aviation hub will sell for anywhere from 15 to 23 times its annual pre-tax earnings. Even though the Sydney agreement happened during a global travel freeze, those buyers were looking far beyond the dismal revenues of that specific year. The fundamental strategy is simple. Purchasers are locking down a permanent, monopolistic grip on a metropolitan area's air traffic for generations to come. But suppose you cannot purchase an established facility and decide to construct a brand new one from the ground up. Your initial hurdle is securing up to 140 square kilometers of flat land, with Denver's facility famously sprawling larger than San Francisco. Purchasing that property, sorting out legal ownership, relocating residents, and bypassing ecological reserves will burn through hundreds of millions before construction even begins. Next, you have to lay down the runways, which are far more complex than standard highways. These deeply reinforced structures must repeatedly absorb the impact of 400-ton jets touching down at massive speeds for decades on end. Constructing just one of these massive strips typically exceeds $1 billion, with Heathrow's proposed third runway projected to cost up to $18 billion. To put that in perspective, while Gatwick itself was bought for £1.5 billion, adding a new strip later would cost 8 times more. After the tarmac, you must build the terminals, which function like self-contained cities featuring massive underground labyrinths just for routing luggage. They require industrial-grade climate control, strict explosive detection checkpoints, and specialized boarding bridges capable of matching countless airplane models. Running all this non-stop requires immense capital, pushing Beijing and Istanbul's recent airport projects to staggering price tags of $17 and $12 billion. Even after securing funds, endless ecological reviews, neighborhood town halls, and fierce legal battles will inevitably stall the project for several more years. There is one specific pitfall that ruins aviation megaprojects more consistently than anything else out there. Since these builds always require massive loans, you start owing interest the exact moment the funds hit your account. Every single month of stalled construction means you are bleeding money on billions borrowed, while bringing in absolutely zero income. Look at Berlin-Brandenburg. Initially slated to launch in late 2011, it shockingly did not welcome passengers until 9 years later. What was supposed to be a €2 billion endeavor ultimately skyrocketed to a jaw-dropping €7 billion. It finally debuted right as global flights vanished due to the pandemic, leading a longtime project advisor to make a grim prediction. He publicly declared it would likely never turn a profit, forever doomed to act as a financial black hole needing endless state subsidies. The culprit behind this near-decade delay was not bad weather or union strikes, but rather a completely dysfunctional fire safety network. An automated smoke clearing system was thrown into the blueprints far too late, and it immediately failed when engineers put it to the test. Each time inspectors spotted an issue, progress halted for complete redesigns, which were further complicated when safety regulations were unexpectedly updated. Because wiring was installed without proper blueprints, checking the cables meant completely tearing apart previously finished construction zones. Combine that with poorly sized escalators, glitching automatic doors, and a ceiling that could not even stop the rain. None of these issues were individually disastrous, yet collectively they swallowed an extra €4 billion and a decade of time. Denver experienced a comparable nightmare in the 90s, delayed for 16 months because a wildly expensive automated luggage network literally shredded passenger bags. While those empty halls gathered dust, that simple delay bled the city dry at a rate of over $1 million every single day. Once an airport finally welcomes passengers, revenue starts flowing in through two completely separate operational channels. The first category revolves around aviation basics, billing carriers for utilizing the fundamental physical infrastructure. This includes taxing the weight of incoming planes, charging for outgoing travelers, and demanding rent for jets resting on the tarmac. To put it in perspective, dropping a heavy jet into Heathrow costs carriers around $9,000, alongside $55 per departing traveler. While this certainly sounds incredibly lucrative, there is a massive catch. International governments aggressively cap what these facilities can actually charge. The reasoning makes total sense, considering major transit hubs function as absolute monopolies for their respective cities. If strict oversight didn't exist, a solitary gateway like Heathrow could ruthlessly gouge anyone desperate enough to land in London. To maintain fairness, national watchdogs establish strict limits, like the British Authority recalculating maximum passenger tolls every 5 years. For the current cycle ending in 2026, they slashed Heathrow's permitted traveler fee down to roughly £21, a steep 20% drop. Facility executives immediately fired back, claiming the restricted budget would sabotage vital upgrades, but regulators insisted the hub was already highly profitable. This exhausting legal battle highlights a brutal structural truth. Federal officials dictate your flight income, and it is never as high as you want. Trapped by these aviation pricing limits, major privatized terminals cleverly built an unregulated secondary empire that expands much faster than actual traveler numbers. This alternative business involves everything beyond the actual landing strips, accounting for roughly 37% of global airport earnings. In the United States, vehicle parking absolutely dominates this commercial sector, handing Dallas/Fort Worth a staggering $250 million and LAX roughly $181 million. They pull this off because airports completely monopolize their surrounding real estate, easily demanding $100 daily for covered spots while regulators look the other way. Beyond parking, terminals squeeze massive profits from vendors through a clever leasing structure known as the minimum annual guarantee. Any brand setting up shop must agree to surrender a hefty percentage of their total sales, or a predetermined base fee, whichever is higher. This brilliant contract completely eliminates downside risk for the landlord, meaning a failing boutique still owes that guaranteed base payment. On the flip side, if a duty-free outlet breaks sales records, management automatically skims their percentage off every single transaction. To maximize this cash flow, the very architecture of the building is deliberately weaponized to keep you lingering near storefronts. Immediately after surviving the high-anxiety security check, designers funnel you into a decompression zone featuring lowered ceilings and soothing illumination. The entire psychological purpose of this calm environment is to signal that you survived the worst, subtly encouraging you to spend money. Many enormous tax-free pavilions are built like mazes, completely blocking any direct, straightforward path from the checkpoint to your flight. Forcing travelers to navigate directly through these commercial labyrinths has been proven to skyrocket purchasing by nearly 60%. Planners even exploit human anatomy, knowing that right-handed flyers dragging luggage will subconsciously drift and glance toward their dominant side. To capitalize on this instinct, major concourses subtly curve to the left, keeping expensive luxury goods permanently fixed in your rightward vision. Yet, despite this brilliant money-making machine, investing in aviation infrastructure is incredibly risky because operating expenses are absolutely staggering. Security screening alone requires buying massive, strictly mandated 3D scanners and explosive detectors that must be immediately replaced whenever regulations change. These compulsory tech upgrades financially cripple many global hubs, and that is before dealing with the massive, power-hungry underground luggage network. Beneath the terminals, miles of automated sorting belts consume colossal amounts of electricity and require expert engineers around the clock. If that subterranean maze breaks down, the entire facility halts, while heating and cooling spaces larger than city blocks rack up staggering utility bills. Emergency crews and fire engines must remain fully staffed and ready, even if just one delayed freighter is landing at 3 in the morning. For airports in colder climates, keeping the tarmac ice-free demands a multi-million-dollar fleet of plows and de-icers on permanent standby. Shutting down a runway for even 2 hours is a massive blow to both income and prestige, so these operations simply never stop. Whether a facility sees 20 million travelers or half that amount, those astronomical fixed expenses barely fluctuate. Then, in early 2020, this precarious model of high fixed costs and variable income faced its absolute worst-case scenario. By spring, 2/3 of the global commercial fleet was suddenly parked, causing industry passenger revenues to plummet by a catastrophic $418 billion. For terminal operators, this was uniquely disastrous because the lights stayed on, bond payments were still due, and insurance premiums never paused. They went from raking in fortunes to earning practically nothing, yet their enormous operating expenses remained stubbornly high. Inside the concourses, shops bound by strict minimum annual guarantees suddenly faced empty corridors and zero sales. Forcing these stores to pay those minimums would have bankrupted them, leaving desolate storefronts that would wreck the commercial vibe for years. Astute managers wisely shifted to a percentage-based rent model, sacrificing immediate income to keep their vital retail ecosystem alive for the future. To survive, the cleverest hubs did the unthinkable. They transformed their empty passenger gates and aprons into massive freight processing centers. Interestingly, smaller regional hubs didn't suffer this massive revenue crash, simply because they never had millions of travelers to begin with. Any facility processing under 1 million annual flyers is virtually guaranteed to bleed cash, lacking the retail and parking income to offset round-the-clock operating expenses. These minor airfields only keep their lights on through heavy government subsidies, justified by the need for rural connectivity and local political interest. The real dilemma emerges when these tiny hubs try to survive without state funds, inevitably falling into a dangerous trap: total reliance on a single budget airline. Mega carriers like Ryanair have practically perfected a ruthless business model designed to exploit this exact vulnerability. When a desperate airfield begs for traffic, the airline swoops in with a tantalizing deal, but the attached strings are absolutely punishing. They demand landing fees be slashed in half, alongside millions of euros in mandatory tourism promotion payments that essentially act as direct kickbacks. Cornered and desperate, the management has no real choice. It's either surrender to these extortionate terms or accept a completely abandoned facility. Sure, they get their precious foot traffic, but almost all the generated profit is immediately siphoned right back to the carrier. If the airport ever dares to push back against these aggressive demands, the airline casually threatens to pack up and fly elsewhere. Just like that, a once bustling regional hub can be instantly reduced to a desolate, echoing cavern overnight. However, there is an even more catastrophic and humiliating blunder in aviation history: the infamous phenomenon of the ghost airport. These are colossal infrastructure projects that open their doors to absolutely nobody because the initial demand forecasts were catastrophically detached from reality. Spain's Ciudad Real Central perfectly illustrates this. Conceived during the mid-2000s boom with a massive runway, it was supposed to seamlessly handle Madrid's passenger overflow. When its gates finally opened in 2008, disaster struck fast, driving the operators into bankruptcy within just 2 short years. By 2012, the entire facility was shut down, as carriers flat out refused to divert routes to a small town situated far from their actual market. During a desperate bankruptcy auction for this billion-euro white elephant, a Chinese firm audaciously offered a mere 10,000 euros, which the court quickly dismissed. Following years of failed attempts to sell, a buyer eventually scooped it up in 2018 for 56 million euros, barely 5% of its original construction cost. Today, this colossal monument to poor planning serves only as a giant parking lot and scrapyard for retired airplanes. An even bleaker picture paints itself in Sri Lanka at the Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, financed by massive Chinese loans and constructed in an isolated region. Despite being engineered to welcome 1 million annual travelers, this $209 million project now sees barely a dozen people walk through its doors daily. Now saddled with a crushing annual debt payment of over $23 million, the government has resorted to renting out terminal spaces just to stockpile rice. Both of these disastrous failures trace back to a singular, fatal flaw: choosing blind political ambition over hard route planning data. Nobody bothered to consult the carriers, who are the true experts at knowing exactly where travelers actually desire to fly. If the planes refuse to land at your shiny new runway, the crowds will never arrive, and without customers, the entire enterprise immediately collapses. Flip the script, however, and you witness incredible success, like Spain's Aena Group, which masterfully runs dozens of highly lucrative hubs domestically and internationally. In 2024, they raked in nearly €6 billion, boasting a jaw-dropping 60% operating margin in an industry where 10% is usually highly praised. Over in Germany, the Fraport Group echoes this triumph at Frankfurt Airport, acting as a vital continental cargo and connecting crossroads where airlines simply cannot afford to leave. Retail profits at Aena surged by nearly 15% last year, easily beating the actual rise in foot traffic. With a staggering million daily travelers passing through, simply persuading each person to spend €1 extra generates hundreds of millions in additional yearly profit. Airlines stick with major hubs like Frankfurt because travelers actively expect to route through them, making relocation far too risky for business. This reveals the ultimate industry power dynamic. While tiny airfields desperately beg for routes, massive global hubs become mandatory stops that carriers absolutely must serve. Looking ahead, the traditional layout is completely transforming into what urban designers now call an aerotropolis. Rather than just linking a runway to a distant downtown, entire modern metropolitan centers are now being constructed directly surrounding the flight lines. Hotels, distribution centers, and corporate parks naturally expand outward from the gates, all hungering for immediate access to global flight network. The financial reasoning is incredibly simple. Businesses handling urgent cargo, like medical supplies or tech components, lose money for every minute spent in transit. Smart operators capitalize on this by leasing out adjacent real estate at sky-high rates, securing reliable cash flow completely separate from daily ticket sales. Meanwhile, inside the buildings, the biggest threat to retail profits is the dreaded security checkpoint, because waiting travelers simply aren't shopping. To combat this bottleneck, operators are pouring cash into advanced facial recognition technology that scans your documents seamlessly while you keep walking. They want to eliminate lines entirely, making the screening process as quick and unnoticeable as tapping a card at a local transit station. Ultimately, financial survival boils down to sheer volume, which is exactly why regional strips handling under 1 million flyers consistently bleed cash. These smaller fields only survive through state bailouts or blind hope, whereas mid-tier facilities processing 15 to 25 million people face a completely different reality. Moving beyond those moderately sized hubs, we enter the territory of colossal aviation giants, processing upwards of 40 million flyers annually. These behemoths operate on another level entirely, with operators like Aena proving in 2024 that you can hit staggering profit margins pushing 60%. However, running these massive facilities isn't a walk in the park. They attract intense government oversight and require mind-boggling financial commitment. Even while pouring billions into terminal upgrades and battling over fee structures, their sheer volume generates unparalleled amounts of liquid cash. Looking at the entire global aviation landscape, the average facility nets about a 16% profit. While that percentage might seem surprisingly tame, the astronomical sums of money flowing through these gates tell a very different story. A stellar financial year versus a disastrous one usually hinges on subtle shifts, like how much extra cash tourists drop in terminal stores. Changing interest rates on massive loans also play a huge role, alongside sudden travel disruptions that instantly crush revenue while expenses remain frozen. In fact, it is those unyielding, inescapable operating expenses that give airport investors absolute nightmares. They don't fear rival transit hubs or airline disputes. They dread the reality that massive bills must be paid whether planes land or not. Navigating that terrifying gap between booming traffic and empty runways is precisely where aviation billionaires are either minted or completely ruined. So, if you ever find yourself purchasing an aviation hub, realize you aren't just acquiring a standard everyday company. You are securing a captive ecosystem that essentially forces airlines to hand over fees, travelers to browse boutiques, and drivers to pay for parking. It is undoubtedly one of the most resilient business models on Earth, assuming your pockets are deep enough to survive the journey to the top.